Look at this huge cosmic butterfly, and here's a massive star brain. Maybe its owner is watching us closely through this eye of God. Even though these cloudy formations look like living creatures, they actually came about because of the leftover processes from dead stars. But what if we're wrong, and the universe isn't lifeless? Imagine if one of your tiny cells became as big as the whole universe you can see. Then, you'd see lots of interesting things happening inside, like making proteins, copying genes, and building cell walls. And since we can explain these happenings with the rules of science, without knowing you're inside a living thing, it would all seem lifeless. So, perhaps we don't fully understand the universe around us? In this video, you'll learn whether galaxies could be connected like a giant brain. We might even find thinking structures out in space, or things we don't normally think of as alive, like the chair you're sitting on. There are scientific ideas that suggest the universe might not only be alive, but also have feelings. Some smart people noticed that the way the universe looks is kind of like a piece of a living brain. If I told you these pictures were taken by a telescope from NASA called James Webb Space Telescope, you'd believe me. But there's a twist. One of these pictures isn't from space. It actually got second place in a small photography contest in 2021. It's a close-up of around 300,000 tiny nerve cells called neurons. Let's say that's just a lucky match. But there's more to it. The International Project Aquarius tries to copy how the universe grew using really powerful computers. In there, you can see a whole lot of space, like millions of light years, where big groups of galaxies are interacting. And if we go billions of years into this computer simulation, we'll see organized patterns called the cosmic web. It's not just a coincidence, and this makes us think that maybe the universe is much more than just a bunch of lifeless stuff. When people who aren't scientists saw something that looked like neurons, they might as well say that baldness looks like a polar cap on Mars, but that doesn't turn Mars into a giant head. So, two scientists from Italy, Franco Vazza and Alberto Folletti, one studying space and the other brains, started to look more closely at the connections between nerve networks and cosmic networks. They found something really surprising, and told everyone about it in a science journal in November 2020. They figured out that if we make neural networks smaller by 1 to 100 micrometers and cosmic networks bigger by 5 million to 500 million light years, the way stuff is spread out in cells and galaxies is the same in terms of math. Also, they saw that a regular node in nerves usually has 4 connections, and in galaxies, it's usually 5. Both nerves and galaxies have things inside them that don't do anything much. In nerves, it's mostly water, 77%, and in galaxies, it's dark energy, 72%. But does this mean we're living inside a giant brain? If it's true, it could mean that there's a really advanced type of civilization that controls the whole universe. Some scientists are open to this idea. A professor named Biddle from the University of Minnesota Duluth thinks that if we think of the universe as a giant brain, it could help us solve really big science problems. You know, for a long time, scientists have been trying to mix Einstein's idea about how really big things work with the way tiny particles behave. That's called quantum mechanics. But both ideas are pretty useless when you're not looking at things that are really big or really small. But this professor noticed something interesting about how nerve networks behave in math. Depending on how you look at it, they follow different rules. It's like sometimes they act one way, and other times they act a different way. Even though these rules don't fully agree, they sort of come together under certain conditions. Could the same thing be happening with how the universe works? However, there's one important difference. Unlike a nerve network, the universe doesn't have a key thing that would make it truly alive and aware. In our brains, signals move pretty quickly, ranging from half a meter to 100 meters per second. The universe doesn't have this kind of quick communication. That's like super fast, almost happening instantly. But when we talk about how fast things in the universe can interact, the fastest speed is the speed of light. That's around 300,000 kilometers per second. But if we look at the whole universe, this speed is actually super slow. Even the galaxy closest to us, Andromeda, looks like it did 2.5 million years ago, and it would take the same amount of time for any message to travel between us and that galaxy. Imagine if the universe were a giant brain working at that speed. It would have had its first thought billions of years ago, and it might not even be able to finish that thought. This is because the universe is getting bigger and bigger really fast, which is tearing apart the connections in its brain. So, in a few billion years, there might only be separate parts of galaxies left, not big clusters. Now, could there be smaller thinking things out there? According to the rules of physics, it seems like there should be smart beings in space. You might even be one of them. But to figure out how this could happen, let's look at your room. We're not interested in your posters or messy socks from a scientific point of view. We're interested in something you don't really notice: the air in your room. There are billions and billions of tiny particles zipping around, filling up all the space. But here's the thing. Why doesn't the air all gather at the top of your room and leave you without air to breathe? Don't worry, there's a scientific rule that helps. It's called the second law of thermodynamics. It says that things that are hot in a cold environment will cool down instead of heating up, and gases tend to spread out evenly on their own. Things can only change if someone or something puts in energy to make them change. Even though scientists in the 19th century knew about this rule, they didn't fully understand why it worked. A physicist named Ludwig Boltzmann figured out the real reason. He saw that when particles are spread out in a messy way, there are tons of different ways they could be spread out, and most of them look similar. But if you want something like all the air to gather at the ceiling, that's really rare and unique compared to the usual messy arrangements. But this idea brought up a big issue. You see, according to what Boltzmann thought, the rule about how things spread out could sometimes break on its own. Imagine if you flipped a coin a bunch of times. Normally, you'd get a mix of heads and tails. But if you flipped it a crazy amount of times, there's a tiny chance you'd get only heads every single time. However, you'd have to flip the coin for way longer than your whole life to make that happen. This idea didn't sit well with many scientists because it suggested that the fundamental rules of nature could randomly change. To challenge Boltzmann's idea, they came up with something called the Boltzmann brain paradox. It's not about making fun of Boltzmann's smarts. It's about the strange things that could happen if we believe that super rare combinations of particles could show up eventually. If we wait long enough, even an everyday thing like a hammer or an exact copy of a human could form out of dust and gas in space. It would have fake memories of life on Earth and believe it's real, but it would vanish after a short while. Boltzmann wasn't too bothered by this, but some astronomers found a way around it. Edwin Hubble showed that the universe isn't staying still, but it's expanding. This means the universe had a beginning around 13.8 billion years ago, and that's way less time than needed for those Boltzmann brains to pop up naturally. But then, while figuring out how the universe started with the Big Bang, scientists hit a roadblock. It seemed impossible to explain why the Big Bang happened using the regular rules of physics. That's when they looked at Boltzmann's work in a different way. In 1973, a physicist named Edward Trien asked whether the universe could be like a tiny energy burst on the tiniest scale, happening in empty space. These bursts would pop up and disappear super quickly. These are the unlikely things Boltzmann talked about. And unlike the weird stuff like cosmic hammers and copies of people, we're sure these tiny energy bursts actually exist. So it's possible our universe started from one of these bursts after an incredibly long time. If the Big Bang was actually one of these energy bursts, then things like Boltzmann brains should appear all over the universe, including in our minds. It's a wild idea. You might be one of these self-created minds, but you wouldn't even notice. And if our world is just made by one of these Boltzmann brains, what's the point of studying it and making theories? This strange consequence of the Big Bang theory has worried scientists for years. Some even suggest that to avoid the idea of Boltzmann brains, the whole universe might end up destroyed. This is it for today's video. What do you think of our video? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more future updates. Thanks for watching.